Tonight, we begin with something that might surprise you. We're diving into the fascinating world of medieval entertainment, leisure, and fun. When medieval people weren't working themselves to the bone or surviving the plague, they found some truly remarkable ways to enjoy themselves. From violent sports that would make modern football look tame, to drinking games that could kill you, from festivals where chaos reigned to entertainment so strange you won't believe it was real, medieval fun was wild, dangerous, and absolutely fascinating. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a fundamental question. Did medieval people even have free time? The answer is more complicated than you might think. For the vast majority of the population, peasants who made up roughly 80 to 90% of medieval society, life was dominated by work. Backbreaking, dawn-to-dusk, survival-dependent work. But here's the surprising thing. Medieval people actually had more days off than most modern workers. The medieval calendar was packed with holy days, feast days, and religious festivals. Some historians estimate that medieval peasants had between 100 and 150 days off per year. That's more vacation time than most Americans get today. Of course, these weren't paid vacation days, they were religious observances, and you were expected to attend church services, participate in community rituals, and honor the saints. But after the religious obligations were fulfilled, the rest of the day was yours. And medieval people used that time to play, to celebrate, to drink, and to engage in activities that would shock modern sensibilities. The concept of leisure in the Middle Ages was fundamentally different from our modern understanding. There was no clear separation between work and play, between sacred and profane, between community obligation and personal enjoyment. Everything was interconnected, woven into the fabric of daily life. For nobles, leisure was a different matter entirely. The aristocracy didn't work in the way peasants did. Their days were filled with activities that we might consider leisure: hunting, hawking, tournaments, feasting. But these weren't just hobbies. They were displays of status, training for war, and ways of maintaining social hierarchies. A noble who spent his days hunting wasn't just having fun. He was demonstrating his wealth, his power, his right to rule. He was practicing skills that would be useful in battle. He was reinforcing his position at the top of the social order. Leisure for nobles was never just leisure. It was always political. But even nobles had moments of pure enjoyment, times when they could set aside the weight of their responsibilities and simply play. They played board games, listened to music, watched performances, and engaged in elaborate courtly rituals that were part game, part social performance. The church had complicated feelings about leisure. On one hand, the church recognized that people needed rest, that constant work was unhealthy, that celebration was part of human nature. The church calendar was designed to provide regular breaks from labor, to give people time to worship and to enjoy God's creation. On the other hand, the church was deeply suspicious of many forms of entertainment: dancing, drinking, gambling, sexual activity. All of these were potential sources of sin. The church constantly warned against excessive pleasure, against activities that might lead people away from God and toward damnation. This tension between the need for leisure and the fear of sin shaped medieval entertainment. Many activities existed in a gray area, tolerated but not approved, enjoyed but also condemned. Medieval people learned to navigate this tension, to find ways to have fun while staying within the bounds of acceptable behavior, or at least not getting caught when they crossed those bounds. The rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the seasons and the agricultural calendar. Winter was a time of relative rest, when there was less work to be done in the fields. This was when many festivals and celebrations took place, when people had time to gather, to tell stories, to play games. Spring and summer were busier, with planting and tending crops. But even during these busy seasons, there were breaks. Sundays were always days of rest, at least in theory, and the numerous feast days provided regular interruptions to the work routine. Harvest time was both the busiest and the most celebratory period. The work was intense, with everyone laboring to bring in the crops before bad weather struck. But once the harvest was complete, there would be a great celebration, a harvest festival where the community would feast, drink, and give thanks for the year's bounty. These seasonal rhythms created a pattern of work and rest, of labor and celebration that structured medieval life. People didn't have leisure time in the modern sense, with evenings and weekends free. Instead, they had intense periods of work punctuated by days or even weeks of celebration. If there's one thing medieval people knew how to do, it was throw a festival. And these weren't polite, orderly affairs. Medieval festivals were chaotic, raucous, sometimes violent celebrations that turned the normal social order upside down. The medieval calendar was packed with festivals. There were the major Christian holidays, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. There were saints' feast days, and with hundreds of saints in the medieval calendar, there was always something to celebrate. There were seasonal festivals marking the turning of the year, May Day, Midsummer, harvest festivals. Each of these festivals had its own traditions, its own rituals, its own forms of entertainment. But they all shared certain characteristics. They were communal. They involved feasting and drinking. They often included elements of role reversal and social transgression. And they provided a release valve for the tensions and frustrations of daily life. Let's start with Christmas, which in the Middle Ages was very different from the holiday we know today. Medieval Christmas was a 12-day festival running from December 25th to January 6th. It was a time of feasting, drinking, and merrymaking that would make modern office parties look tame. The centerpiece of medieval Christmas was the feast. Lords would host elaborate banquets for their households and tenants, with multiple courses of meat, fish, pies, and sweets. The goal was abundance, excess, a temporary suspension of the usual scarcity. People ate until they were stuffed, drank until they were drunk, and celebrated until they collapsed. But medieval Christmas also had a darker, stranger side. There was the tradition of the Lord of Misrule, a commoner who would be chosen to preside over the Christmas festivities. For the duration of the festival, this person would have authority, could give orders, could mock the nobility. It was a temporary inversion of the social hierarchy, a safety valve that allowed people to express resentment and frustration in a controlled way. There were also mumming plays, performances where people would dress in costumes and masks and act out traditional stories. These plays often involved cross-dressing, with men playing women and women playing men. They included bawdy humor, sexual innuendo, and mockery of authority figures. For a brief time, the normal rules didn't apply. Easter was another major festival, but it had a different character. Easter was about renewal, rebirth, the triumph of life over death. The celebrations were more religious, more solemn, but they still included feasting, games, and entertainment. One popular Easter tradition was egg rolling, where decorated eggs would be rolled down hills. This was both a game and a symbolic act representing the rolling away of the stone from Christ's tomb. Children would compete to see whose egg could roll the furthest without breaking. There were also Easter plays, dramatic reenactments of the crucifixion and resurrection. These could be elaborate productions with multiple actors, costumes, and special effects. They were both religious instruction and entertainment, teaching biblical stories to a largely illiterate population while also providing spectacle and drama. May Day was a celebration of spring, of fertility, of the return of warmth and life after the long winter. It was one of the most joyous and also one of the most controversial festivals in the medieval calendar. The centerpiece of May Day was the maypole, a tall pole decorated with ribbons and flowers. Young people would dance around the maypole, weaving the ribbons into intricate patterns. This was a courtship ritual, a way for young men and women to interact, to flirt, to choose partners. But May Day also had a reputation for sexual license. Young people would go into the woods on May Eve, ostensibly to gather flowers and greenery to decorate the village. But everyone knew that more than flowers were being gathered. May Day was a time when the normal rules of sexual behavior were relaxed, when young people could experiment, when pregnancies that resulted were quietly accepted. The church was deeply ambivalent about May Day. On one hand, it was a celebration of God's creation, of the beauty and abundance of nature. On the other hand, it was associated with pagan traditions, with sexual immorality, with behavior that the church officially condemned. But the church couldn't suppress May Day. It was too popular, too deeply rooted in folk tradition. Midsummer, the summer solstice, was another major festival. It was celebrated with bonfires, dancing, and all-night revelry. People believed that midsummer was a magical time, when the boundary between the human world and the fairy world was thin, when strange things could happen. Young people would jump over the bonfires, a ritual that was supposed to bring good luck and fertility. Couples would hold hands and leap together, and if they made it across without letting go, it was a sign that their relationship would last. It was dangerous, with burns and injuries common, but that was part of the thrill. Harvest festivals were times of thanksgiving and relief. The hard work of bringing in the crops was done, and the community could relax and celebrate. These festivals involved feasting on the newly harvested grain, drinking the new ale, and giving thanks to God for providing. But harvest festivals also had a competitive element. There would be contests to see who could reap the fastest, who could bind the most sheaves, who could thresh the most grain. These contests were both practical, getting the work done, and entertaining, providing a way to show off skill and strength. One particularly strange harvest tradition was the corn dolly, a figure woven from the last sheaf of grain. This dolly was believed to contain the spirit of the harvest, and it would be kept in the house over the winter to ensure good luck and a successful crop the next year. It was a blend of Christian and pagan beliefs, a folk tradition that the church tolerated but didn't officially endorse. Carnival, the period before Lent, was perhaps the wildest of all medieval festivals. Knowing that they would soon have to give up meat, alcohol, and other pleasures for the 40 days of Lent, people went all out during Carnival. It was a time of excess, of indulgence, of doing everything that would soon be forbidden. Carnival celebrations included elaborate parades with people dressed in costumes and masks. There was music, dancing, street performances. There was also a lot of drinking, a lot of eating, and a lot of sexual activity. Carnival was a time when the normal rules were suspended, when people could behave in ways that would be scandalous at any other time of year. The most famous carnival tradition was the election of a mock king or queen, someone who would rule over the festivities. This person would be dressed in ridiculous clothing, would be paraded through the streets, would be both honored and mocked. It was another example of the medieval love of role reversal, of temporarily turning the social order upside down. All of these festivals served important social functions. They provided entertainment and relief from the hardships of daily life. They reinforced community bonds, bringing people together in shared celebration. They allowed for the expression of emotions and desires that were normally suppressed. And they provided a safety valve, a controlled way to release social tensions before they exploded into violence or rebellion. Medieval festivals were not just fun. They were essential to the functioning of medieval society, a way of maintaining social cohesion while also allowing for moments of transgression and release. If you wanted to have fun in medieval times, chances are you'd end up in a tavern. These establishments were the social centers of medieval life, places where people gathered to drink, to talk, to play games, to hear news, and to escape the drudgery of daily existence. Taverns existed in every town and most villages. They ranged from simple alehouses, basically someone's home where they brewed and sold ale, to more elaborate establishments with multiple rooms, entertainment, and food. But they all served the same basic function, providing a place where people could drink and socialize. The primary beverage in medieval taverns was ale. This wasn't the clear, filtered beer we drink today. Medieval ale was thick, cloudy, and often had bits of grain floating in it. It was brewed without hops, which meant it didn't keep well and had to be consumed quickly. It was also relatively weak, with an alcohol content of around 2 to 3%. People drank ale because water was often unsafe. Rivers and wells were contaminated with waste, and drinking water could make you sick. Ale, because it was boiled during the brewing process, was safer. So people drank ale all day, every day. Children drank it, adults drank it, even monks and nuns drank it. But tavern ale was different from the ale people drank at home. Tavern ale was often stronger, and it was consumed in larger quantities. Going to the tavern wasn't just about quenching your thirst, it was about getting drunk, about loosening up, about forgetting your troubles for a few hours. Wine was also available in taverns, but it was more expensive and generally consumed by wealthier patrons. Wine was imported from France, Spain, and Italy, and it was a status symbol. A merchant or minor noble might drink wine to show off his wealth, while peasants stuck to ale. Taverns were rowdy places. They were loud, smoky, and often violent. Arguments would break out over dice games, over insults, over women. Fights were common, and they could turn deadly. Many taverns had weapons hanging on the walls, not for decoration, but because patrons had been required to check them at the door. But taverns were also places of community and connection. This was where you heard the news, where you learned what was happening in the wider world. Travelers would stop at taverns and share stories from distant places. Merchants would discuss business. Farmers would complain about the weather and the harvest. Taverns were also places of entertainment. There might be musicians playing, minstrels singing songs, storytellers spinning tales. Some taverns had dice games, card games, or board games. Others had more elaborate entertainment like puppet shows or trained animals. Drinking games were popular in medieval taverns. One common game was I Love My Love with an A, where players would take turns saying phrases that started with successive letters of the alphabet. If you couldn't think of a phrase, you had to drink. Another game involved passing a cup around a circle, with each person taking a drink and then making up a rule that everyone else had to follow. These games could get out of hand quickly. The goal was often to get as drunk as possible, and people would drink until they passed out, vomited, or started fights. Tavern keepers had to be skilled at managing drunk patrons, at diffusing conflicts before they turned violent, at knowing when to cut someone off. Women in taverns were a complicated subject. Female tavern keepers, called alewives, were common. Brewing was often women's work, and many women ran successful tavern businesses. But women who drank in taverns, especially women who weren't the proprietor, were viewed with suspicion. A woman drinking in a tavern was assumed to be sexually available, a prostitute, or at least a woman of loose morals. This wasn't fair, but it was the reality. Respectable women generally didn't frequent taverns, at least not without male relatives to accompany them. Prostitution was indeed common in and around taverns. Some taverns were essentially brothels, with rooms upstairs where prostitutes would take their clients. Other taverns simply tolerated prostitutes working in their establishments, taking a cut of the profits. The church condemned taverns as dens of sin, places where people wasted their money, ruined their health, and endangered their souls. Priests would preach against the evils of drink, warning that taverns were gateways to hell. But these warnings had limited effect. People kept going to taverns, kept drinking, kept enjoying themselves despite the church's disapproval. Some taverns had reputations as particularly dangerous or disreputable. These were the places where criminals gathered, where stolen goods were fenced, where violence was expected. Smart people avoided these establishments, but they also added to the mystique and excitement of tavern culture. Other taverns were more respectable, catering to merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobles. These establishments might have better ale, cleaner facilities, and stricter rules about behavior. They were still rowdy, but they were less likely to end in bloodshed. The social dynamics of taverns were complex. There was a hierarchy, with regular patrons having more status than newcomers, with wealthier drinkers commanding more respect than poor ones. But there was also a leveling effect. In a tavern, a peasant could sit next to a merchant, could share a drink, could have a conversation that would never happen in other contexts. Taverns were essential to medieval social life. They provided entertainment, community, and a space where people could be themselves, could relax, could forget for a few hours that life was hard and often short. They were places of joy and sorrow, of friendship and violence, of connection and isolation. They were, in many ways, the heart of medieval fun. Music was everywhere in medieval life. It wasn't something you listened to through headphones or at concerts. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence, accompanying work, worship, and celebration. And when medieval people wanted to have fun, music and dancing were at the center of it. The medieval soundscape was very different from ours. There was no recorded music, no amplification, no electronic instruments. All music was live, performed by human voices and acoustic instruments. This meant that music was a communal activity, something you participated in rather than passively consumed. Singing was the most common form of music. People sang while they worked, rhythmic songs that helped coordinate labor and made the time pass more quickly. They sang in church, elaborate polyphonic hymns that filled cathedrals with sound. They sang at home, simple melodies passed down through generations. Work songs were particularly important. Farmers would sing while plowing, the rhythm helping them maintain a steady pace. Weavers would sing while working their looms. Sailors would sing sea shanties to coordinate their efforts. These songs were functional, but they were also a form of entertainment, a way to make hard work more bearable. Religious music was central to medieval life. The church was the primary patron of music, and much of the musical innovation of the period happened in religious contexts. Gregorian chant, with its haunting, otherworldly melodies, was the soundtrack of medieval worship. But religious music wasn't just for church. People sang hymns at home, taught them to their children, used them as lullabies and prayers. Secular music was where things got really interesting. This was music for entertainment, for dancing, for celebration. It was performed by professional musicians called minstrels, troubadours, or jongleurs, depending on the region and time period. These musicians were wanderers, traveling from town to town, from castle to castle, performing for whoever would pay them. They were skilled in multiple instruments, could sing, could tell stories, could juggle and perform acrobatics. They were entertainers in the fullest sense, providing a complete show. The instruments of medieval music were diverse. There were string instruments like the lute, the harp, and the vielle, an early form of the violin. There were wind instruments like the recorder, the shawm, and the bagpipes. There were percussion instruments like drums, tambourines, and bells. Each instrument had its own character, its own associations. The harp was considered noble and refined, often played by aristocratic ladies. The bagpipes were associated with peasants and outdoor celebrations. The lute was versatile, used for both courtly love songs and bawdy tavern ballads. Dancing was inseparable from music. When people gathered to celebrate, they danced. Medieval dances ranged from simple circle dances where everyone held hands and moved together, to more complex partner dances that required skill and practice. One popular dance was the carol, a circle dance where participants would sing while they danced. The leader would sing a verse, and everyone else would join in on the chorus. The dance would continue for hours, with the circle moving faster and faster until people were breathless and dizzy. Another common dance was the estampi, a lively dance with a distinctive rhythm. This was more of a performance dance, often done by skilled dancers while others watched. It involved intricate footwork, jumps, and turns, and it was both athletic and artistic. Dancing was also a form of courtship. Young people would dance together, would hold hands, would move in close proximity in ways that weren't allowed in other contexts. Parents and chaperones would watch carefully, but dancing provided opportunities for flirtation, for connection, for romance. But dancing was also controversial. The church was deeply suspicious of dancing, seeing it as a potential source of sin. Dancing could lead to lustful thoughts, to inappropriate touching, to sexual activity. Some church authorities tried to ban dancing altogether, though these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The church was particularly opposed to dancing in churchyards, a common practice in medieval times. People would gather in the cemetery after church services and dance among the graves. To modern sensibilities, this seems macabre, but medieval people saw it differently. The churchyard was community space, and dancing there was a way of celebrating life in the presence of death. There were also professional dancers, performers who would entertain at feasts and festivals. These dancers were often acrobats as well, performing flips, handstands, and other impressive physical feats. They might dance on their hands, on stilts, or while juggling. Music and dancing were also part of courtly culture. Nobles would host elaborate entertainments featuring musicians and dancers. These performances were highly stylized, following strict rules of etiquette and decorum. They were displays of refinement and culture, ways of demonstrating that the nobility was superior to the common people. Troubadours were particularly important in courtly culture. These were poet-musicians who composed and performed songs about courtly love, chivalry, and noble deeds. Their songs were sophisticated with complex melodies and clever lyrics. They were the rock stars of the medieval world, admired and imitated. But not all medieval music was refined. There was also a tradition of bawdy songs, drinking songs, and satirical ballads. These songs mocked authority figures, celebrated sexual exploits, and generally thumbed their noses at propriety. They were popular in taverns and at festivals, where people could let loose and enjoy humor that would be scandalous in other contexts. One famous collection of medieval songs is the Carmina Burana, a manuscript of songs written by wandering scholars and clerics. These songs are surprisingly raunchy, celebrating drinking, gambling, and sexual adventures. They remind us that medieval people, even educated ones, enjoyed crude humor and earthy pleasures. Music was also believed to have healing properties. Certain melodies were thought to cure illness, to calm troubled minds, to drive away evil spirits. Musicians might be called to play for sick people, using music as a form of medicine. The role of music in medieval life cannot be overstated. It was entertainment, yes, but it was also much more. It was a way of marking time, of creating community, of expressing emotions that couldn't be put into words. It was a connection to the divine, a celebration of life, and a comfort in times of sorrow. Medieval people didn't just listen to music, they made it. They danced to it. They lived with it. It was an integral part of their world, and it was one of the primary ways they had fun, found joy, and connected with each other. Medieval people loved games. They played them in taverns, in village squares, in castle halls. They played for fun, for competition, and for money. And some of these games were so popular, so addictive, that authorities tried repeatedly to ban them, with little success. Dice games were probably the most popular form of gambling in the Middle Ages. Dice were easy to make, easy to carry, and easy to play. You could gamble with dice anywhere, anytime, with anyone. And people did, constantly. The most common dice game was hazard, a precursor to the modern game of craps. The rules were complex, involving multiple rolls and various betting options. But the basic idea was simple. You bet on the outcome of the dice roll, and if you guessed right, you won money. Dice games were played in taverns, in the streets, in military camps. Soldiers were particularly fond of dice, gambling away their pay, their equipment, even their clothes. There are records of soldiers gambling so recklessly that they ended up naked, having lost everything they owned. The church condemned dice games as sinful, a waste of money, and a path to ruin. Preachers would rail against the evils of gambling, warning that dice were the devil's tools. But people kept playing, kept gambling, kept hoping that the next roll would be the one that made them rich. Dice were also associated with cheating. Loaded dice, dice that were weighted to favor certain numbers, were common. Skilled cheaters could manipulate dice rolls, could palm dice, could switch fair dice for loaded ones. Gambling dens were full of tricksters and con artists, and naive players could lose everything to a skilled cheat. Card games were another popular form of entertainment, though cards didn't become common in Europe until the late 14th century. Once they arrived, they quickly became popular, with people playing for money, for fun, and for social interaction. Early playing cards were hand-painted and expensive, luxury items for the wealthy. But as printing techniques improved, cards became cheaper and more widely available. By the 15th century, even peasants could afford a deck of cards. The games played with these cards were diverse. Some were simple gambling games where you bet on which card would be drawn. Others were more complex, requiring strategy and skill. Many medieval card games have been lost to history, but some, like tarot, have survived in modified forms. Board games were also popular. Chess was the most prestigious, a game associated with nobility and intellectual prowess. Learning to play chess was part of a noble education, and skill at chess was seen as a sign of intelligence and strategic thinking. But chess wasn't just for nobles. Simpler versions of the game were played by common people, using crude boards and pieces carved from wood or bone. Chess sets were valuable possessions, sometimes passed down through generations. Other board games included tables, an early form of backgammon, and Nine Men's Morris, a strategy game played on a grid. These games were played in taverns, in homes, in castle halls. They provided entertainment, mental stimulation, and opportunities for friendly competition. Children had their own games, many of which are still played today. They played hide-and-seek, tag, and various ball games. They played with hoops, rolling them through the streets with sticks. They played with tops, spinning them and competing to see whose would spin the longest. Medieval children also played with dolls, though these were simple figures made from scraps of cloth or carved from wood. They played house, imitating adult activities, preparing for the roles they would eventually assume. Outdoor games were popular when weather permitted. One common game was stool ball, an early form of cricket or baseball. Players would try to hit a ball with a stick and then run between two stools. It was simple, energetic, and fun. Another popular game was bowls, where players would roll balls toward a target, trying to get as close as possible. This game was played by all social classes, from peasants to kings. It was competitive, but also social, a way to spend time with friends while enjoying the outdoors. Gambling wasn't limited to dice and cards. People would bet on anything: wrestling matches, archery competitions, animal fights, even the weather. Betting was a way of adding excitement to any event, of having a stake in the outcome. But gambling could also be destructive. People would lose their savings, their homes, their livelihoods. Families would be ruined by a father's gambling addiction. The social costs of gambling were high, which is why authorities tried repeatedly to regulate or ban it. Despite these efforts, gambling persisted. It was too popular, too deeply ingrained in medieval culture. People loved the thrill, the risk, the possibility of winning big. And in a world where life was hard and uncertain, where most people had little control over their circumstances, gambling offered a chance, however slim, to change your fate. Games and gambling were essential parts of medieval fun. They provided entertainment, competition, and social interaction. They offered escape from the drudgery of daily life, moments of excitement and possibility. And they remind us that human nature hasn't changed much. We still love games, still love to compete, still love the thrill of taking a risk and hoping for the best. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval entertainment, It's worth reflecting on what all of this tells us about medieval people, about human nature, and about the role of fun in human life. Medieval people had fun. Despite the hardships, despite the poverty, despite the constant threat of disease and death, they found ways to enjoy themselves. They played games, told stories, danced, drank, celebrated, and laughed. They created a rich culture of entertainment that was diverse, creative, and deeply human. The forms of entertainment we've explored, festivals, taverns, music, games, sports, storytelling, feasting, all of these served important functions beyond simple enjoyment. They created community, reinforced social bonds, provided relief from hardship, and allowed for the expression of emotions and desires that were normally suppressed. Medieval entertainment was also deeply tied to the rhythms of life, to the agricultural calendar, to religious observances, to the seasons. It wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into the fabric of existence, providing structure, meaning, and moments of joy. Many medieval forms of entertainment seem strange or shocking to us today. The violence of medieval sports, the crudeness of medieval humor, the excess of medieval feasting, all of these reflect a culture that was very different from our own. Medieval people had different values, different sensibilities, different ways of understanding the world. But beneath these differences, we can see fundamental human needs and desires, the need for community, for connection, for laughter, the desire to escape, to imagine, to play, the impulse to celebrate, to mark important moments, to create meaning through ritual and tradition. Some forms of medieval entertainment have survived, transformed, but recognizable. We still have festivals, though they're different from medieval ones. We still play games, though the games have changed. We still tell stories, though the medium has evolved. We still gather to eat, drink, and celebrate, though the context is different. Studying medieval entertainment helps us understand the past, but it also helps us understand ourselves. It reminds us that entertainment is not frivolous, that play is essential to human well-being, that joy and laughter are as important as work and duty. Medieval people created a culture of entertainment that was rich, diverse, and deeply meaningful. They found joy in simple things, created elaborate celebrations from limited resources, and built communities through shared experiences of fun and laughter. They remind us that even in difficult times, even when life is hard, people find ways to play, to celebrate, to enjoy themselves. The bizarre, violent, bawdy, joyful world of medieval entertainment is part of our heritage. It's a reminder of where we've come from, of how much has changed, and of how much has stayed the same. So the next time you're at a festival, playing a game, telling a story, or just enjoying time with friends, remember that you're participating in traditions that stretch back centuries. You're part of a long human history of finding joy, creating community, and having fun. Medieval people would recognize what you're doing, even if the forms have changed. They'd understand the impulse to celebrate, to play, to laugh, because at the end of the day, whether you're a medieval peasant or a modern person, the need for fun, for joy, for entertainment, that's universal. That's what makes us human. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval entertainment. I hope you've learned something, been entertained, and maybe even been a little shocked. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to explore. Until next time, sleep well, and be glad you live in an age where entertainment doesn't usually involve getting trampled by a mob or watching a bear fight.